Hello, respected viewers. So welcome back to my channel, George from Ireland. In this video, I'm talking about whether Ukraine is going to be compelled to negotiate peace later this year or indeed in early 2025. There are all sorts of indications that support for Ukraine is slipping. So President Zelensky, he was in New York for the General Assembly of the United Nations, because that's obviously the permanent headquarters of the United Nations organization. It's always the last week of September the UN General Assembly meets. Presidents, prime ministers, other world leaders often jet into New York and address the General Assembly. Putin didn't go; it's not been for several years. Now, he wouldn't be immune from arrest in the United States, but he would be in the UN building because it belongs to the United Nations, not to the United States. But wouldn't you have to travel through US territory to get there? Anyway, so he delivered his stonking speech, and the Russians delegation said they were not going to listen to such nonsense. Nevertheless, their ambassador stayed in the room to hear that. And President Zelensky has taken the opportunity to meet President Joe Biden to visit a vital arms factory in Pennsylvania, manufacturing shells, indeed signing one of them, and ramming home the point to the American public that all this money that's donated to Ukraine is actually often spent in the United States, manufacturing the weapons, which is then shipped to Ukraine, and that stimulates the American economy. Now, I know Americans would say, yes, but we'd like these shells to be for our military, or we could, instead of spending on this, have a tax cut, spend it on something else, pay off some of the national debt. So there is mounting pressure on Ukraine to reach a settlement with Russia. The United States has just announced another 8 billion US dollars for Ukraine, which is obviously very welcome, but almost certainly the US is going to be less generous than before. This there's a declining liberalities because of, I suppose, Ukraine fatigue, a sense that the war is unwinnable for Ukraine. Everybody else is less generous. Germany has drastically slashed its military aid. Germany has persistently refused to give these Taurus missiles to Ukraine, which would be a major boost to Ukraine if they got them. And I think they wouldn't need any US cooperation to do so. So if you're not going to give much in terms of financial value, you could give something which is excellent, but they're not going to do that. Likewise, United Kingdom has dithered and looks like are not going to give those long range Storm Shadow missiles, or grant permission to be used in Russian sovereign territory. They can be used in the illegally Russian occupied zones of Ukraine, but they can't be used in Russia proper. Uh, but it's actually, although they're British and French manufacture, the French call them Scalp. I can't remember what it stands for again, but something like long portée, as in long range, uh, is because they rely on US satellites and stuff like that for targeting. So indirectly, the United States would be involved. Anyway, so they're getting less weaponry. The death toll is mounting. Still have some sort of recruitment problems, and that's it. So the less economic developed countries, commonly called the global south, Russia person called the global majority, saying, well, it's driven up oil and gas prices and grain prices and stuff like that. A Ukrainian ship exporting grain, I think, to Egypt was struck by the Russians the other day. Now, the Ukrainians have not responded in kind. They tried to sink merchant ships taking grain from Russia, or indeed Crimea, which is obviously illegally occupied Ukrainian territory, held by Russia, or from Lugansk and so on, from the Sea of Azov. They could do so, but they might say, well, that makes us the bad guys. Maybe some of these might be neutral ships. They wouldn't want to queer the pitch there. Richard Gowan, I had the grave misfortune to know him at school. He's something high up in the United Nations now, despite only having 1 degree. And he said, yes, there's a growing sense from the global south that this war needs to end now. And was it Piotr Pavel? Do I say pronounce his name correctly? The Czech president. He said, "Well, you got to get real. Ukraine's not going to take back all its territory." Now, I would love to be wrong, but I'm afraid to say I do concur with him. I don't see that this is possible. They've taken back quite a lot. At the maximum penetration, Russia about 27% of Ukrainian territory. Then they withdrew from some of it. They pushed out more of it, down to maybe 15%. They've ground forward to hold almost 20% now. I mean, some of that sees way back in 2014 when they invaded Crimea, and only one person was killed. In Crimea, mostly ethnically and linguistically Russian, largely welcomed the Russian army. The Russian army was there anyway. It was a very, very straightforward operation. Only one person was killed in that. Obviously, just because Russian is your first language, that doesn't automatically mean you want to be part of Russia. I know some Russophone Ukrainians who even can't even speak Ukrainian, but nevertheless they regard themselves as Ukrainian, and that's it. But yeah, there is obviously a correlation there. And even if you're ethnically Russian, again, that doesn't guarantee that you want to be part of Russia. But yes, it is more likely. A lot of people of mixed ethnicity. Um, so how much longer can this go on for? It's difficult enough for Ukraine. The Kursk incursion had some success, but it wasn't a triumph. I suppose there was it was a bit risky. They didn't really bet the bank on it, which could have paid major dividends. On the other hand, it could have ended in cataclysm. They didn't do that. The Russians are grinding forwards towards various important towns, okay, like Pokrovsk, Vuhledar, and those are going to fall. But the question is when. If they fall now before winter sets in, that's a gain for Russia. If Ukraine can hold them to the end of like October, the weather's getting so bad, Ukraine may well hold them to like March, and that's a relative success because there's just a lot more casualties. And Ukraine's strategy is not to fight to the bitter end, is always pull out while there is still time to withdraw and not to lose too many troops. Is preserving troops is more important than holding territory. I think they're right on that one. And so there are obviously recruitment problems for Russia, but it's worse for Ukraine, and Ukraine is just not willing to conscript people at age 18. If they did so, they would solve their recruitment problems at a stroke. And plus, 10 million Ukrainian refugees abroad, some of whom are military age males. And I know there are exemptions of those who are medically unfit or diplomats or international athletes or things like that. But a lot of people who are capable of serving, and I know some of them, and I don't ask why. And obviously, I can't blame them. I wouldn't want to get killed either. I don't want to be severely wounded and end up a quadruple amputee or something like that. I don't want to be paralyzed from the neck down. I don't want to be captured and severely tortured by Putin's goons. And there's very ample evidence that happens. And so on. So they're not doing it. One thing that interests me is those guys who were prisoners of war in Russia had a horrific time for 2.5 years in some cases, and recently been exchanged. Do they have to rejoin the army? I mean, that might be too much. Often they're emaciated, they're malnourished. And what I might do is say, okay, you have to do something. You serve the border guard on the border of Slovakia, something. It's completely safe, not going to be traumatized, and then it's your job to catch people trying to escape. And you're highly motivated. Well, I did my bit and I suffered horrendously. So you're not sneaking off and getting away without doing your part. Okay, so yeah, that's why I think peace may well come, probably will come in 2025, and it's going to be an agreement to disagree, a messy compromise, some liminality about the illegally occupied regions in Luhansk and Donetsk. So because Ukraine has made no progress towards recapturing these in 2024. They've caused problems for Russia. They've obviously inflicted quite casualties, but ultimately they're still being driven back, even not very much. Russia might do it as well. But the trouble is, it won't be a permanent peace. Russia will lick its wounds, rebuild its armed forces, and attack again. But military aid to Ukraine must not stop if this war stops in 2025. It must be beefed up to have some sort of cordon sanitaire against Russia invading the rest of Europe, building major defenses that Russia can never get across. Some of the refugees would return and start rebuilding it, but it's going to cost hundreds of billions of dollars to rebuild Ukraine. Right, and the Ukraine still hasn't gone to the max, like shutting off that Druzhba pipeline. And yes, Ukraine gets something like $230 million a year, but Russia gets billions out of it. It's just a no-brainer. Is to just cut it off, that oil and gas, and that would annoy Hungary and Slovakia, I suppose. Right. Thank you so much for watching my channel. Make sure to subscribe on Patreon, donate on PayPal. Goodbye.